Racist flight attendant denies Snoop Dogg, but what happened next shocked everyone. The terminal buzzed with the usual chaos of airport life. Announcements echoing through the intercom, hurried footsteps, and the hum of conversation. Snoop Dogg strolled into the first-class lounge, wearing his signature shades and a leather jacket that caught the light just enough to make heads turn. His calm, composed demeanor was unmistakable, a blend of confidence and charisma that drew glances from those around him. For Snoop, airports were no different from the hundreds of other places he had been. A temporary stop on the way to something bigger. At the check-in counter, a young family struggled to manage their luggage, while a group of businessmen discussed stock prices over their phones. Snoop barely glanced at them as he made his way toward the gate. He was used to blending in even when he stood out. Today was just another travel day, or so he thought. Behind the counter at the first-class boarding gate, a woman in a neatly pressed uniform stood with a practiced smile that barely masked the sharp judgment behind her eyes. Her name tag read Shorek, but her demeanor suggested she was more focused on maintaining control than providing stellar service. She scanned the line of passengers with quick, calculating glances. When her eyes landed on Snoop Dogg, her expression shifted ever so slightly. She straightened her posture, her smile tightening as if bracing herself for something. Snoop approached the gate with a measured stride, holding his boarding pass between two fingers. He offered it to her without a word, his face calm as ever. The attendant took the pass but paused, her eyes narrowing slightly as she studied it. "Sir, are you sure you're in the right line?" she asked, her tone polite but laced with skepticism. Snoop tilted his head slightly, his lips curling into a faint, knowing smile. "Last I checked," he replied, his voice smooth and unbothered. "But feel free to double-check if you need to." Her cheeks flushed slightly at his response, but she wasn't ready to let it go. "This line is for first-class passengers only," she said, holding his boarding pass as though inspecting it would reveal some grand deception. "Are you certain this is your ticket?" Snoop took a deep breath, still calm, but there was a flicker of something sharper behind his eyes. He wasn't new to this kind of interaction. "That's what it says, doesn't it?" he said, gesturing lightly to the pass in her hand. "Or you see something I don't?" The attendant glanced around, aware that a few nearby passengers had started paying attention to the exchange. She cleared her throat, her voice lowering. "I'll need to verify this with my supervisor. Please step aside." Snoop raised an eyebrow but said nothing. He stepped to the side of the line, his movements deliberate, his composure unshaken. Other passengers filed past him, some throwing him sympathetic glances, others avoiding eye contact entirely. The tension in the air was palpable, but Snoop remained a picture of calm. Behind the counter, the attendant whispered something to a colleague, her gestures sharp and hurried. The colleague, an older man with a weary expression, glanced briefly at Snoop before shaking his head and returning to his work. The attendant huffed quietly, clearly dissatisfied, but she straightened her uniform and approached Snoop once more. "Sir, I'll need to see some additional identification," she said, her tone clipped but still coated with a thin veneer of professionalism. Snoop chuckled softly, the sound low and unbothered. "You need my ID now?" "Thought the boarding pass was enough." "It's standard procedure in cases like this," she replied quickly, though her words felt rehearsed, as though she were grasping for justification. "We have to ensure the integrity of our first-class cabin." Snoop leaned slightly closer, lowering his shades just enough to reveal his sharp, piercing gaze. "Cases like what, exactly?" he asked, his voice steady but pointed. The attendant faltered for a moment, her confidence wavering under his gaze. "It's just a precaution," she said, her tone less certain now. "To ensure there aren't any misunderstandings." Snoop pulled his wallet from his jacket pocket with the same calm precision he had displayed all along. He handed over his ID without a word, his expression unchanging. The attendant took it, her fingers trembling slightly as she inspected the document. After a moment, she nodded and returned it to him, though the flush in her cheeks betrayed her discomfort. "You're clear to board," she said, her voice stiff and formal. "Enjoy your flight." Snoop slid his ID back into his wallet, adjusting his shades as he stepped forward. He paused for a moment, turning to glance at her over his shoulder. "Next time," he said, his tone light but cutting, "might want to check your assumptions before you make someone step aside." The attendant's face reddened further, but she said nothing, her lips pressed into a thin line. Snoop walked toward the jet bridge, his stride unbroken, as though the encounter hadn't fazed him in the slightest. As he settled into his seat in the first-class cabin, Snoop noticed a few passengers still casting curious glances in his direction. Some seemed embarrassed by what they had witnessed, while others appeared indifferent. Snoop ignored them, pulling out his phone and scrolling through messages as the cabin filled with the chatter of boarding passengers. The attendant from the gate entered the cabin a few minutes later, her professional smile back in place, though her eyes betrayed her lingering discomfort. She avoided looking directly at Snoop as she assisted other passengers, her movements quick and mechanical. Snoop didn't pay her any mind, his focus on his phone and the playlist he was curating for the flight. The cabin lights dimmed as the plane prepared for takeoff. Snoop leaned back in his seat, slipping his headphones on and letting the music drown out the world around him. The tension from the earlier encounter lingered faintly in the air, but Snoop had already let it roll off his shoulders. This wasn't the first time he had dealt with this kind of treatment, and it likely wouldn't be the last. But he had learned long ago not to let it define his day. As the plane ascended into the sky, the hum of the engines filled the cabin, and the passengers settled into their seats. The flight attendant moved through the aisle, offering drinks and snacks with the same practiced smile she had worn at the gate. When she reached Snoop's row, she hesitated for the briefest of moments before placing a glass of champagne on his tray table. "Compliments of the airline," she said, her voice even but her gaze avoiding his. Snoop looked up at her, his expression unreadable. He took the glass, nodding slightly. "Thanks." She moved on quickly, her shoulders stiff as she continued down the aisle. Snoop watched her for a moment before turning his attention back to his phone. The music continued to play, a steady rhythm that matched his unshaken calm. The flight passed uneventfully for the most part, but Snoop couldn't help noticing the occasional glances from the flight attendant as she moved through the cabin. Her earlier confidence had given way to something else, unease, perhaps, or a recognition of the misstep she had made. Snoop didn't dwell on it, but he could feel the weight of the moment lingering between them. As the flight leveled out, Snoop adjusted his seat, reclining slightly. The soft leather embraced him as he sipped the complimentary champagne. The bubbles tickled his tongue, but it wasn't the drink that held his thoughts. He caught sight of the flight attendant again, moving through the aisle with the same mechanical efficiency. She avoided his row for the moment, likely busying herself with other passengers, but her movements betrayed a certain stiffness. Snoop smirked to himself. He could sense the tension in her shoulders, the way she avoided looking at him even when she passed close by. Across the aisle, a young man wearing a rumpled suit and thick glasses seemed to notice it too. He glanced at Snoop, then at the flight attendant, before hesitantly leaning forward. His voice was a nervous whisper, audible only because of the relative quiet of the cabin. "Excuse me, Mr. Dogg?" the young man said, stumbling over his words. Snoop turned his head slightly, lowering his shades to look at the man with a raised brow. "Yeah, I saw what happened back at the gate," the man continued, his voice gaining a little more steadiness as he spoke. "That was messed up. I mean, how she treated you. Totally uncalled for." Snoop studied him for a moment, then gave a small nod. "Appreciate it, man. But don't stress yourself. I've seen worse." The young man's face flushed slightly, and he fidgeted with the hem of his jacket. "Still, I wanted to say something. People shouldn't get away with stuff like that, you know?" Snoop's smirk softened into a slight smile. "Takes guts to speak up. Respect." The man nodded, sitting back in his seat, though his expression remained conflicted. He seemed as though he wanted to say more, but instead he settled for offering Snoop a small, encouraging smile before turning his attention to the tablet in his lap. Snoop leaned back again, adjusting his headphones. He appreciated the gesture, but he wasn't in the mood to dwell on the earlier encounter. Moments like that came and went, like ripples in a pond. No sense in letting them throw off his vibe. The flight attendant, however, wasn't quite as adept at letting things go. She hovered near the galley, her hands busily rearranging items on a tray, though there was no need for it. Her colleague, an older woman with a warm demeanor, watched her with a raised brow. "You've been fidgeting since takeoff," the colleague said softly, her tone laced with curiosity. "Something on your mind?" The younger attendant stiffened, her hands freezing mid-motion. "It's nothing," she said quickly, her voice tight. "Just a long day." The older woman's gaze flicked briefly to the first-class cabin, where Snoop sat in his seat, now scrolling through his phone. "Is it about him?" she asked, her voice quiet but pointed. The younger attendant's cheeks reddened slightly, and she avoided her colleague's gaze. "I don't know what you mean," she muttered. The older woman let out a soft sigh, leaning against the counter. "You've been on edge ever since the gate. Look, I don't know what's going on in your head, but you need to be careful. People notice these things." The younger attendant bristled, her shoulders squaring defensively. "I was just doing my job." "Were you?" the older woman asked, her tone gentle but firm. "Or were you making assumptions?" The words hung in the air between them, heavy with unspoken implications. The younger attendant didn't respond, her lips pressed into a thin line. After a moment, she turned away, busying herself once again with the tray. The older woman watched her for a moment longer before shaking her head and returning to her duties. Back in his seat, Snoop felt the familiar tug of turbulence as the plane hit a pocket of rough air. He glanced out the window, watching the clouds ripple like waves beneath the wing. Flying had always been a strange experience for him, a mixture of freedom and confinement, of being untouchable yet completely vulnerable. He leaned his head back against the seat, letting the steady rhythm of his music soothe his thoughts. The flight attendant reappeared a short while later, her professional smile firmly in place as she moved through the cabin with the beverage cart. When she reached Snoop's row, she hesitated for the briefest of moments before addressing him. "Would you like a refill on your champagne, sir?" she asked, her tone polite but strained. Snoop removed one ear of his headphones, glancing up at her with a raised brow. "I'm good," he said simply, his tone neutral. She nodded quickly, almost too quickly, and moved on to the next row. Snoop watched her retreating figure for a moment, his expression unreadable. He could see the effort in her posture, the way she seemed to force herself to act natural, even as her movements betrayed her discomfort. The young man across the aisle leaned forward again, his voice low. "She's definitely sweating it," he murmured, his tone conspiratorial. Snoop chuckled softly, shaking his head. "Let her sweat," he said, his voice calm but edged with a quiet amusement. "Maybe she'll learn something." The young man grinned, sitting back in his seat. "Fair enough." As the flight continued, the tension in the air began to ebb, though it never fully dissipated. Snoop remained a figure of quiet composure, his presence commanding attention even when he said nothing. The flight attendant, meanwhile, seemed to grow more and more aware of the eyes on her, of the unspoken judgment that hung in the air like a low hum. When the plane finally began its descent, the announcement crackled over the intercom, instructing passengers to return their seats to their upright positions and secure their belongings. Snoop buckled his seatbelt, his movements unhurried, as he prepared for the landing. The young man across the aisle offered him a small, encouraging nod, and Snoop returned it with a faint smile. As the plane touched down and taxied to the gate, the cabin filled with the sounds of passengers gathering their belongings and preparing to disembark. Snoop remained seated, waiting patiently as the crowd began to shuffle toward the exit. The flight attendant stood near the door, her professional smile once again in place, though there was a tightness to her expression that hadn't been there before. When Snoop finally rose from his seat, he moved with the same unhurried grace that had marked his every action. As he approached the door, the flight attendant offered him a strained smile, her voice faltering slightly as she said, "Thank you for flying with us, sir. Have a good day." Snoop paused for a moment, turning to look at her with an unreadable expression. He tilted his head slightly as though considering her words, before giving a small nod. "You too," he said, his tone even. And with that, he stepped off the plane, leaving the attendant standing there with her thoughts. As Snoop stepped into the jet bridge, he felt the weight of the tension he'd left behind on the plane lift slightly. The air was cooler here, a sharp contrast to the confined warmth of the cabin. He adjusted his shades and walked with the same relaxed stride he'd carried throughout the entire ordeal, unbothered on the surface but with thoughts bubbling underneath. The terminal was alive with its usual chaos, passengers rushing to their gates, airport staff guiding stragglers, and the distant hum of announcements echoing from unseen speakers. Snoop weaved through the crowd with ease, his presence attracting a few double takes but mostly blending into the sea of travelers. A small group of passengers who had been in first class trailed behind him, their conversations hushed but filled with speculation. "Did you see how calm he was?" one woman whispered to her companion. "I would have lost it if that happened to me." Her companion nodded, their voice quieter. "Yeah, but I think he's used to it. That's the sad part, isn't it?" Snoop caught snippets of their words as he walked, but he didn't react. He'd heard it all before. The whispers, the half-hidden glances, the subtle shifts in body language when people recognized who he was. It came with the territory, and he had learned long ago to focus on what mattered and let the rest fade into the background. As he approached baggage claim, he noticed a small crowd gathering near one of the carousels. Phones were out, cameras ready, and the buzz of curiosity was almost tangible. Snoop's first instinct was to keep moving. He wasn't in the mood for a spectacle, but something about the energy of the group made him pause. He adjusted his shades and moved closer, standing just on the edge of the commotion. At the center of the crowd stood an older woman, her face etched with a mix of confusion and frustration. She held a piece of paper in her hand, her voice raised as she spoke to an airline employee who stood across from her, looking increasingly flustered. "I've been waiting for over an hour," the woman said, her tone firm but not aggressive. "This was supposed to be a simple trip, and now I don't even know where my bag is." The employee stammered an apology, their hands fidgeting nervously. "I'm so sorry, ma'am. We're doing everything we can to locate your luggage, but there's been a delay with—" "That's not good enough," the woman interrupted, her voice breaking slightly. "I have important items in that bag, things I can't replace. I need someone to actually help me." Snoop watched the exchange for a moment, his expression thoughtful. He could see the frustration in the woman's eyes, the way her hands trembled slightly as she clutched the paper. It wasn't just about the bag. This was about being heard, about feeling like she mattered in a system that so often treated people as inconveniences. He stepped forward, his presence causing a ripple through the crowd. Conversations quieted, and all eyes turned to him as he approached the woman and the employee. "Ma'am," Snoop said, his voice calm but commanding enough to draw attention. "What's going on here?" The woman turned to look at him, her expression shifting from frustration to surprise. She blinked, as though unsure whether she was really seeing who she thought she was. I've lost my luggage," she said, her voice faltering slightly. "And no one seems to be able to help me." Snoop nodded, his gaze shifting to the employee. "What's the holdup?" he asked, his tone steady but firm. The employee's face flushed, their words tumbling out in a rush. "There's been a mix-up with the baggage transfer, and some items are still being processed. We're trying to resolve it as quickly as possible, but—" Snoop held up a hand, stopping them mid-sentence. "Listen," he said, his voice measured. "I get that things happen, but this lady's been waiting long enough. Let's figure this out, yeah?" The employee nodded quickly, their posture straightening as they seemed to realize the weight of the moment. "Yes, sir. I'll check with the team right away." They hurried off toward a nearby desk, leaving Snoop and the woman standing amidst the now silent crowd. The woman looked at him, her expression a mix of gratitude and disbelief. "Thank you," she said softly. "I didn't mean to cause a scene, but it's been a long day." Snoop gave her a small smile, his demeanor as steady as ever. "No need to thank me," he said. "Just making sure people get treated right." The crowd began to disperse, the moment passing but leaving an impression on those who had witnessed it. Snoop stayed with the woman until the employee returned, a relieved look on their face as they handed her a claim ticket and assured her the bag would be delivered to her home by the evening. As the woman walked away, her shoulders visibly lighter, Snoop turned and continued toward the exit. The encounter had been brief, but it had reminded him of why he carried himself the way he did. It wasn't just about staying calm in the face of ignorance, it was about using his presence to make a difference, even in the smallest of ways. As he stepped outside, the crisp evening air greeted him, carrying with it the hum of traffic and the distant chatter of travelers. A sleek black car waited at the curb, its driver stepping out to open the door for him. Snoop slid into the back seat, leaning back as the car pulled away from the terminal. The city lights blurred past the windows, their glow reflecting faintly in Snoop's shades. He pulled out his phone, scrolling through messages as the car navigated the winding streets. One notification caught his eye, a text from a name he recognized immediately. "Looking forward to your speech tomorrow. Let me know if you need anything." Snoop smiled faintly, his mind shifting to the reason for this trip. He wasn't just here to fly first class or make an impression at the airport. Tomorrow he would be speaking at a major event, addressing issues of equality, representation, and the importance of breaking down barriers. It was a role he had embraced over the years, not just as an artist or a celebrity, but as someone who had seen the world from both sides and knew the power of using his platform for good. He typed a quick response, his fingers moving with practiced ease. "All good. Appreciate it. See you tomorrow." The car came to a smooth stop in front of a towering hotel, its glass facade reflecting the vibrant energy of the city around it. Snoop stepped out, nodding to the driver before making his way inside. The lobby was sleek and modern, its polished floors gleaming under soft, ambient lighting. A concierge greeted him with a warm smile, guiding him to the private elevator that would take him to his suite. As the elevator doors closed, Snoop leaned against the wall, his mind briefly drifting back to the events of the day. The encounter with the flight attendant, the crowd at baggage claim, the whispers and glances, it all blended into the larger picture of his life, a constant balancing act between being seen and being understood. When the doors opened, he stepped into the quiet luxury of his suite, the city skyline stretching out before him through floor-to-ceiling windows. He set his bag down and sank into a plush armchair, the weight of the day finally settling into his shoulders. But even as he sat there, a part of him remained focused, thinking ahead to the speech he would deliver tomorrow. The flight attendant's face flickered in his memory, a reminder of the work that still needed to be done, the conversations that still needed to be had. He reached for his notebook, flipping it open to a blank page. With a pen in hand, he began to write, his thoughts flowing steadily as he prepared to turn the day's experiences into something more, a story, a lesson, a call to action. The morning light crept through the curtains of Snoop's hotel suite, illuminating the sleek furniture and the notebook resting on the coffee table. He stirred awake slowly, the weight of the previous day still fresh in his mind. He wasn't one to dwell on negativity, but the encounter with the flight attendant lingered, not as anger, but as a reminder of the barriers that still existed. The day ahead promised more than just reflection, it was an opportunity. Today, he would address an audience filled with people who could make a difference, people who could amplify his message. For years, Snoop had built his legacy not just through music, but through his advocacy, his ability to connect with communities that needed a voice. This was one of those moments where his words could ripple far beyond the walls of the event hall. After a quick breakfast and a moment of quiet meditation, Snoop dressed in a sharp suit, the crisp fabric a departure from his usual laid-back attire. The image mattered today, not because he needed to prove anything, but because it added weight to his words. As he adjusted his tie in the mirror, he caught his own reflection and smirked. "Let's get it," he murmured to himself, stepping away from the mirror and grabbing his notebook. The car waiting for him outside the hotel was the same sleek black sedan that had brought him from the airport. The driver greeted him with a polite nod, and Snoop slid into the back seat, the notebook resting on his lap. As the car wove through the bustling streets, his mind replayed fragments of the flight attendant's sharp tone, the way she had scrutinized his ticket as though it were counterfeit. He knew her actions weren't unique. She was a symptom of something larger, something that couldn't be fixed overnight. But that didn't mean it couldn't be addressed. The venue for the event was a grand convention center, its modern architecture designed to impress. Large banners with the event's logo hung near the entrance, and a steady stream of attendees flowed inside, their chatter filling the air. Snoop stepped out of the car, his presence instantly commanding attention. Phones were raised, cameras flashed, and whispers rippled through the crowd. He greeted those who approached him with a nod or a brief handshake, his calm demeanor never wavering. As he entered the building, he was met by one of the event organizers, a woman named Carla. Her warm smile and firm handshake immediately set a welcoming tone. "We're so glad you could make it," Carla said, leading him through the bustling hallways toward the backstage area. "Your session is one of the most anticipated of the day." Snoop gave her a small smile. "Appreciate the love. Just here to keep it real." Carla laughed lightly, her steps quick and purposeful. "Well, I think everyone's ready for that. Let me know if there's anything you need before we start." "I'm good," he said, his voice steady. "Just point me to the mic." Backstage, the atmosphere was a mix of calm professionalism and nervous energy. Technicians adjusted microphones, checked lighting cues, and coordinated with event staff. Snoop took it all in stride, settling into a quiet corner to review his notes. He wasn't one to over-rehearse, authenticity was his strength, but he wanted to ensure his message hit the mark. As he waited for his cue, he noticed a familiar face among the staff, a young man who had been sitting across the aisle on the flight. The man's expression lit up when he spotted Snoop, and after a brief hesitation, he approached. "Mr. Dogg," the young man said, his voice filled with a mix of excitement and respect. "I had no idea you were speaking here today." Snoop raised an eyebrow, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "Small world, huh? You working this event?" "Yeah," the man said, nodding. "I'm part of the media team. I was actually on your flight yesterday, and I just wanted to say, the way you handled that situation, that was inspiring." Snoop leaned back slightly, studying the man with an appraising gaze. "Inspiring, huh? What did you take from it?" The man hesitated for a moment, his expression thoughtful. "I think it just reminded me that staying calm in the face of ignorance is powerful. You didn't let her bring you down, but you also didn't shy away from standing your ground. That kind of composure? It's something I hope I can emulate." Snoop nodded slowly, his expression softening. "Appreciate that. But remember, it ain't just about staying calm, it's about what you do with it after. Gotta turn moments like that into something bigger, something that pushes the needle." The man nodded, his eyes shining with understanding. "I'll keep that in mind." Before they could continue, Carla appeared, signaling that it was time. Snoop gave the young man a quick nod before heading toward the stage. As he stepped into the spotlight, the applause that greeted him was thunderous, a wave of energy that filled the room. He stood there for a moment, letting the sound wash over him, before raising a hand to quiet the crowd. When he spoke, his voice was steady, deliberate, and filled with purpose. "Y'all, I ain't here to preach," he began, his gaze sweeping across the audience. "I'm here to share. Share some truths, share some lessons, and maybe give y'all a little something to think about." He paused, letting his words sink in before continuing. "We all got stories. Some we're proud of, some we wish we could rewrite. But the thing about stories? They only matter if we learn from them." The room was silent, the audience hanging on his every word. Snoop's presence was magnetic, his ability to connect with people undeniable. "Let me tell you about yesterday," he said, his tone conversational but edged with gravity. "I'm on this flight, right? First-class ticket, everything legit. But the moment I step up to that gate, I get questioned. Like I don't belong. Like I'm in the wrong line." There was a murmur of recognition from the audience, a ripple of understanding that spread through the room. Now I could have flipped out. I could have made a scene, let my emotions take over. But what good would that do? All that does is feed into their expectations, give them an excuse to write me off. He let his gaze linger on the faces in the crowd, his words deliberate. Instead, I stayed calm. I let her make her assumptions, let her dig herself into that hole. And when it was all said and done, I walked away with my head high. Not for me, but for every person who's ever been made to feel like they didn't belong. The applause that followed was slow at first, then grew into a steady roar. Snoop waited, his expression thoughtful, before continuing. "But here's the thing," he said, his voice cutting through the noise. "It ain't enough to just let it roll off your shoulders. We gotta do more. We gotta call it out, hold folks accountable, and most importantly, we gotta teach. Teach 'em what respect looks like. Teach em what humanity looks like. He closed his notebook, his next words spoken from the heart. Every single one of y'all in this room has the power to make that happen. Whether it's in your workplace, your community, or even your own family, it starts with y'all. The standing ovation that followed was immediate and overwhelming. Snoop stood there, taking it in with a small, satisfied smile. He had done what he came to do, planting seeds of change in the minds of those who were ready to listen. As he stepped off the stage, Carla was waiting for him, her expression a mix of awe and gratitude. "That was incredible," she said, her voice filled with sincerity. "Thank you for sharing that with us." Snoop nodded, his demeanor as calm as ever. "Just speaking truth. That's all it takes." As the crowd continued to clap, Snoop stepped backstage, greeted by staff and event organizers who congratulated him with handshakes and nods of admiration. He accepted their praise graciously, but his mind was already shifting gears. For him, the real work wasn't just in delivering the message, it was in the ripples it would create. Carla approached him again, her clipboard tucked under one arm. "There's a Q&A session scheduled in about 20 minutes, she said, her tone eager. "We've had a lot of questions submitted already. You good to take a few?" Snoop nodded. "Yeah, I'm cool with that. Let's hear what they got." Carla smiled, clearly relieved by his response. "Great. We've set up a small panel in the lounge area. I'll come get you when it's time." With that, she walked off to finalize the arrangements, leaving Snoop with a moment of quiet. He leaned against the wall, pulling out his phone to check his messages. Among the usual texts from friends and colleagues, one caught his attention. It was from an unfamiliar number, but the subject line was clear, "About yesterday at the airport." Curious, he opened it. The message was short, but it packed a punch. "Mr. Dogg, I was the flight attendant at the gate yesterday. I wanted to apologize for my behavior. I've been reflecting on it, and I realize now how wrong I was. If you'd be willing to talk, I'd like to make things right." Snoop stared at the message for a moment, his thumb hovering over the reply button. He wasn't surprised to hear from her. People often reached out after realizing they had crossed a line. What did surprise him was the tone of the message. It didn't feel rehearsed or corporate. It felt genuine. He tapped out a brief reply. "I'm glad you're reflecting. Let's talk. I'll be free later today." He sent the message and pocketed his phone just as Carla returned. "It's time," she said, motioning for him to follow her. He nodded, pushing the earlier interaction to the back of his mind for now. The lounge area had been transformed into a cozy discussion space, with a small stage flanked by plush chairs and a microphone. The audience, a mix of event attendees and media representatives, sat in rows, their eyes fixed on Snoop as he took his seat. Carla introduced him briefly before turning the session over to the moderator, a young journalist with a bright smile and a stack of cards in her hand. "Thank you for joining us, Mr. Dogg," the journalist began, her voice warm but professional. "Your speech earlier really struck a chord with everyone here, and we've got some great questions lined up. Shall we dive in?" Snoop nodded, leaning back in his chair. "Let's do it." The first few questions were straightforward, asking about his work, his thoughts on systemic issues, and his approach to advocacy. Snoop answered each one thoughtfully, balancing honesty with encouragement. The audience hung on his every word, captivated by his ability to speak truth without losing his cool. Then, about halfway through the session, a question came that shifted the tone entirely. "Mr. Dogg," the journalist said, glancing at her card, "one of our audience members submitted a question about something that happened recently. They asked, how do you stay calm in situations where you're clearly being mistreated? Specifically, can you tell us more about your experience at the airport yesterday?" The room fell silent. All eyes were on Snoop, waiting to see how he would respond. He let the quiet linger for a moment, his gaze steady, before leaning forward slightly. "Good question," he said, his voice measured. "Look, it's not always easy. When someone comes at you sideways, your first instinct is to clap back, right? To defend yourself. But over the years, I've learned that not every fight needs to be fought with words. Sometimes, the best way to handle ignorance is to let your actions speak louder." He paused, scanning the faces in the room. "At the airport, I could tell right away what was going on. She looked at me and saw what she expected to see, not who I really am. And yeah, it stung. But here's the thing. Her assumptions say more about her than they do about me. So I stayed calm, showed her my ticket, and let her make her own mistakes. Because at the end of the day, the truth always comes out. The audience erupted into applause, their admiration for Snoop growing with each word. The journalist smiled, clearly impressed. "That's a powerful perspective," she said. "Thank you for sharing that." The Q&A continued, covering topics ranging from personal growth to community leadership. By the time it ended, the audience was on their feet, giving Snoop another standing ovation. He acknowledged their applause with a nod before stepping off the stage, his mind already returning to the message he'd received earlier. Back in the green room, he checked his phone. The flight attendant had replied, "Thank you for responding. I'm free anytime this afternoon. Let me know what works for you." Snoop typed out a quick response, arranging to meet her at a cafe near the venue. The timing felt right. He wanted to hear what she had to say, but he also wanted her to hear him. The cafe was quiet when he arrived, its cozy interior a welcome change from the bustling energy of the convention center. He spotted her immediately, sitting at a corner table with her hands folded tightly in her lap. She looked up as he approached, her face a mixture of nervousness and determination. "Mr. Dogg," she said, standing as he reached the table. "Thank you for meeting me." He nodded, motioning for her to sit. "Call me Snoop. Let's talk." She hesitated for a moment before sitting down, her gaze dropping to her hands. "First, I just want to say how sorry I am for how I treated you yesterday. There's no excuse for it. I've been replaying it in my mind, and I realize now how unfair I was." Snoop leaned back in his chair, studying her carefully. "Why'd you do it?" he asked, his voice calm but direct. "What made you look at me and think I didn't belong?" She flushed, her cheeks turning a deep shade of red. I don't know," she admitted, her voice trembling. "Maybe it was unconscious bias, or maybe I was just stressed and looking for someone to take it out on. Either way, it was wrong." He nodded slowly, letting her words sink in. "You know, it ain't the first time I've dealt with something like that. Probably won't be the last. But what matters to me is what you do next. You gonna let this be a learning moment, or is it just another thing you move on from?" Her eyes widened slightly, and she straightened in her seat. "I want to learn," she said firmly. "I want to be better. Not just for my job, but for myself." Snoop gave her a small smile, his tone softening. "That's a good start. But it ain't enough to just want it. You gotta put in the work. Read, listen, have conversations with people who don't look like you. And when you catch yourself slipping, call yourself out. That's how you grow." She nodded, her expression earnest. "I will. I promise." They talked for a while longer, their conversation weaving between reflection and forward-looking plans. By the time they parted ways, Snoop could see a shift in her demeanor. She wasn't just apologizing, she was committed to change. As he walked back to the car waiting outside, Snoop felt a sense of quiet satisfaction. The day had been full of moments that could have gone differently, that could have left him feeling drained or defeated. But instead, he had turned them into opportunities. For himself, for the flight attendant, and for the people who had heard his message. Sinking into the back seat, he looked out at the city lights, a faint smile playing on his lips. The work was far from over, but for now, he was content to let this moment stand as a small victory. As the car moved through the streets, Snoop leaned back and let the hum of the engine blend with his thoughts. The day had unfolded better than he'd expected. Moments of conflict had turned into moments of reflection and growth, both for him and for those who crossed his path. It wasn't always like this. He knew some battles left scars instead of lessons. But today it felt like progress. The driver pulled up to the hotel, and Snoop stepped out, nodding his thanks. He made his way through the lobby, past the soft hum of conversations and the quiet clink of glasses at the bar. The staff greeted him politely, their professionalism smooth and practiced. As the elevator doors closed behind him, he allowed himself a rare moment of solitude, the kind where he could let his guard down, even if just for a few minutes. When he entered his suite, the city skyline greeted him, sprawling and alive with 1,000 glowing lights. He walked over to the window, the quiet hum of the city below grounding him in the moment. The notebook he'd left earlier on the coffee table still lay open, the pen resting across its pages. He picked it up, flipping through the notes and ideas he'd jotted down the night before. The words felt raw, unfiltered, but they carried weight. He thought about the flight attendant's apology, the young man's admiration at the convention, and the audience's standing ovation. These weren't isolated moments. They were threads in a larger tapestry, one he'd been weaving for years. Every interaction, every challenge, every triumph added another layer to the story he was telling the world. But there was still work to do. Snoop set the notebook down and pulled out his phone. The messages had piled up while he was at the cafe. Friends, colleagues, event organizers, all reaching out to congratulate him or discuss upcoming projects. One message, however, stood out. It was from the young man at the convention, the one who had approached him on the flight and then again backstage. "Hey Mr. Dogg, I just wanted to say thank you again for your words today. They really hit home for me. I've been thinking about how I can do more in my own life to challenge bias and create change. If you ever need help with anything you're working on, I'd love to be involved." Snoop smiled faintly. The ripple effect was already starting. He tapped out a quick reply. "Appreciate you, man. Keep that energy and stay focused. Plenty of work out there for all of us." After sending the message, he set the phone aside and returned to the window. The night stretched on, the city's pulse steady and unwavering. He thought about how easy it was to get lost in the noise, to let the chaos of the world drown out the voices that mattered. But then there were days like this, where clarity cut through the static, and the message became impossible to ignore. He turned away from the window and grabbed his notebook again, flipping to a fresh page. The pen moved almost instinctively, his thoughts spilling onto the paper in a steady stream. He wrote about the flight attendant, the young man, the woman at baggage claim. He wrote about the audience at the convention, their faces attentive and eager. He wrote about the challenges he'd faced over the years, the lessons he'd learned, and the work that still lay ahead. The words flowed until the page was full, then another and another. When he finally stopped, the room was silent, save for the faint hum of the city outside. He set the notebook down, a sense of calm settling over him. The thoughts that had been swirling in his mind all day now had a place to rest, a foundation to build on. The next morning came quickly, the sunlight streaming through the curtains and casting warm hues across the suite. Snoop stretched and rubbed the sleep from his eyes, his mind already shifting into gear. The day ahead was packed. Meetings, interviews, and another event in the evening. But he felt ready, centered. He made his way down to the hotel restaurant for breakfast, where Carla was waiting at a corner table. She waved him over, a bright smile on her face. "Good morning," she said cheerfully as he approached. "How'd you sleep?" "Not bad," he replied, taking a seat across from her. "Barely at all," she admitted with a laugh. "Still riding the high from yesterday. The feedback's been incredible. People can't stop talking about your speech." Snoop nodded, his expression calm. "Glad it hit home. That's what it's all about." They spent the next hour discussing plans for the evening event, brainstorming ways to keep the momentum going. Carla was sharp, her energy infectious, and Snoop found himself appreciating her dedication to the cause. It was clear she wasn't just here for the job, she believed in the work they were doing. As they wrapped up, Carla leaned forward slightly, her tone turning serious. "You know," she said, "yesterday's speech wasn't just inspiring, it was eye-opening. I think a lot of people left that room rethinking how they approach their own biases. Myself included." Snoop studied her for a moment, then gave a small nod. "That's good to hear. But remember, it's just the start. Inspiration's like a spark, you gotta keep feeding it or it fades out." Carla nodded, her expression thoughtful. "You're right. And I plan to." After breakfast, Snoop headed back to his suite to prepare for the day's meetings. The hours passed quickly, a blur of conversations, handshakes, and brainstorming sessions. Each interaction felt purposeful, a piece of the larger puzzle coming together. By the time the evening event rolled around, Snoop was in his element, his focus sharp and unwavering. The event was smaller than the convention, more intimate, but no less impactful. The room was filled with community leaders, activists, and organizers, all eager to share ideas and collaborate. Snoop listened as much as he spoke, his presence both a guiding force and a steadying influence. As the night wore on, he found himself in a quiet corner of the room, deep in conversation with a young woman who ran a grassroots organization focused on youth empowerment. She spoke passionately about her work, her hands gesturing animatedly as she described the challenges and triumphs of her journey. "It's not easy," she admitted, her voice softening. "Sometimes it feels like the system's working against us at every turn. But then I see the kids we've helped, the ones who've found their voices, and it reminds me why I started this in the first place." Snoop nodded, his gaze steady. "That's the key, remembering your why. It's what keeps you grounded when the noise gets too loud." She smiled, her eyes shining with gratitude. "Thank you for saying that. It means a lot." As the event wound down, Snoop took a moment to step outside, the cool night air a welcome relief from the energy inside. He leaned against the railing, gazing out at the city. The day had been full, but it had also been fulfilling. He thought about the flight attendant again, her apology, and her promise to do better. He thought about the young man at the convention, the woman at baggage claim, and the countless others who had crossed his path. It wasn't just about the moments, it was about what came after. The ripples, the changes, the growth. And for Snoop, that was enough to keep him moving forward.